suspend all other conversations while I'm doing this, folks, so that the people that are in here for this presentation can hear it. If you haven't traveled on the Empire Builder before, folks, welcome aboard. I've got a lot to tell you here. I'm going to cover a lot of ground in about 15 minutes, so here we go. Go ahead, guys. No. Yeah, I'll reopen when I'm done here, yeah. Anyway, we're going to start all the way back at Rugby, North Dakota this morning, folks. If you were to put your finger on the center of the map of North America, right on the center, you would be pointing directly at Rugby, North Dakota. Rugby is the geographical center of North America. Now, how do I know this? Well, there's a sign on our station that says so. As it were, folks, there's a park a couple blocks away where the big sign goes into a little more detail about all of that. The only reason I know that park is there is about 12 years ago I was working this train. We were going the other way. We had a kind of a rough trip. We were 14 hours behind schedule. And we were out of food. And we had a 4-H group on board. We had a Boy Scout group on board. And we had a Girl Scout group on board. And we had more than 400 people on board the train that had ate everything, including the packaging it came in. So we went to this little grocery store on a Sunday morning in Rugby, North Dakota, where there was one person working, and bought several $1,000s worth of food. I thought the young lady having at the checkout stand was going to have a heart attack. But that's how I know that sign is there as well. So our next stop after that, folks, was Minot, North Dakota. Minot is a very important city. It's called the Magic City. And it's called the Magic City because it grew up overnight 3 different times. The first time was in the late 1880s when the railroad came through, and they discovered that it was a great place to get water for steam locomotives. The water was very pure, didn't require a lot of additives, so they built large servicing facilities and rail yards at Minot, and Minot went literally from 0 to about 20,000 in about a year and a half. Now think about that, late 1880s, folks. And you're in North Dakota here, you're not somewhere in the south. Pretty incredible when you think about it. No electricity, no cars, no planes. Trains were fairly new. Really pretty crazy when you think about it. So anyway, grew up overnight 3 different times. The first time, like I said, was in the late 1880s. The second time was in the early 1920s. They discovered oil in this part of the country. And of course that was the dawn of the automobile and aviation eras. So oil and oil products were in a very high demand. Population of Minot went from 20,000 to about 35,000, again in about a year and a half. The third time was in the mid-1950s when the U.S. Air Force built a large military base in Minot, North Dakota, and that brought the population to what it is today, about 55,000. And again, it took them about a year and a half, 2 years to get there. So it's called the Magic City, and they take it seriously, folks. You can't drive down the street in Minot and not see the words magic or magician or magi or Houdini or whatever. Their sports teams have names associated with that. They take it seriously. We do have a saying about Minot, though, that says, "Why not Minot?" Well, if you show up in the winter, you'll know why not. January of this year, as an example, our train pulled into Minot, North Dakota. The wind chill was minus 67 degrees below zero. Yeah, minus 67. Now, for those of you from the Sunbelt states, let me give you an example of how cold that is. If you walk outside without protection of some sort, decent protection on your fingers or toes, frostbite will start to set in about 5 minutes. Okay? That's how cold that is. It's crazy. People think Chicago and so on has a cold winter. Not compared to here.
Or Milwaukee.
Not compared to here. So, anyway, folks, now I talked about that Air Force base, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. How many of you, like me, grew up during the Cold War? I see a fair amount. Okay. So, for those of you that didn't, all of us that grew up during the Cold War, you couldn't read Time magazine every week without, or Newsweek, or one of the other news weeklies, U.S. News, World Report, etc., without seeing some article in there about how many nuclear weapons we had, how many the Soviets had, how many the Brits had, who they thought they were pointed at. This was a regular occurrence. And we frequently had close calls. Many of them we didn't find out about until years after the fact. Let me give you an example of one that is still actually classified. If you go looking for this, you won't find it. Minot Air Force Base was one of the homes of an operation where there were never less for 40 straight years from the date the base opened in the mid-1950s to the early 1990s, just about 40 straight years, there were never less than 4 B-52 bombers in the air out of Minot, loaded with nuclear weapons, ready to fly anywhere in the world on a moment's notice and drop their payload. Okay? You heard me right. 38 straight years. There were always 4 in the air. They would take off with 2 crews on board. The first crew would fly 12 hours out. They would fly out over the Pacific. The second crew, thankfully, always brought them back. The second crew was there, of course, because if they needed to keep going, they refueled and they would keep going. By the way, we didn't do this just out of Minot. We also did this out of Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, where we have a large military base. We did it out of 2 bases in Europe. We did it out of Edwards in California, out of Anchorage in Alaska, and even out of Grand Forks Air Base in North Dakota occasionally as well. So, I mentioned a close call. You might think to yourself, well, this program ended in the early 1990s, and that must be because of Glasnost and Mikhail Gorbachev and all those things, and the much improved relations at the time between the U.S. and the Soviets. Nope. It ended because 2 of those B-52s crashed with nukes on board. Okay? One crashed in the South Pacific out of Diego Garcia. Those bombs were never located. Well, not by us. They're not there. So somebody got them. But we did. More than likely it was probably the Soviet Union at the time that sent a ship in there and got them before we could. The second one, though, was the one that ended the program. It crashed on land in Europe. All but one of the fail-safes failed. That's how close we came. Okay? So it gives you an idea of just what kind of craziness we were playing with for all those years of the Cold War. That just gives you, it's really insane when you think about it. Now, if you want to know more,
she went to the
there's a
bathroom.
little museum at a little town called Cooperstown, North Dakota, where you can go down into a missile silo, and I'll talk to you a little bit about that in a second as well. And it'll tell you all about how that missile silo worked, and it'll give you all the information you ever wanted to know about the Cold War. It's a really unique place. It's worth visiting. I would tell you, though, that when you walk out of that museum, you should bring something else with you to do at Cooperstown, North Dakota, because there isn't a whole heck of a lot else there. So, now, speaking of those missile silos, you just happen to be traveling over the part of the country where there are still more ICBMs or intercontinental ballistic missiles in the ground than anywhere else in the country. There are still about 300 in the ground, roughly between Minot and Wolf Point. Obviously, they're not all right along the rail line or US 2 out here. They're spread out over quite a wide area, but they are still there. They are still active. And the reason I know all this, the classified stuff especially, I've talked about the missiles in the ground for a long time and a little bit about the air base. I didn't know about the other stuff until a couple years ago. I was doing this up here, and an older gentleman came up, struggled mightily to get to me, thanked me profusely for doing this program, and then told me that he was the lieutenant in charge on day number 1 in 1962 when all the missiles in this area went live. So he had information way more than I can incorporate into a program here. But I've kind of worked at it over the years, and so you get an idea a little bit about how important this area actually is. Much more so than you might think. Now, missiles and so on aren't the only thing that's below ground here. I mentioned oil. You happen to be traveling over what's called the Bakken Oil Reserve. This is the second largest oil reserve in the country after the Ford Field in South Texas. The difference is the Ford field, most of the oil comes out in pretty conventional means. Very little of it is fracking. Up here, some of the oil comes out in conventional means via derricks, but the vast majority of the oil, they use a process called fracking to pull the oil out of the ground. Now, fracking is controversial. We all know that. We're not going to get into the controversy. But for those of you that don't know what it is, basically what they do is they bring in very fine sand by rail car. They take that sand, mix it with water, they inject that water into the rock several hundred feet down. It breaks up the rock, and they pull out the oil from around the rock. That's what fracking is. The reason it's controversial, there's three basic reasons. One, you can figure out people that own the land have never really felt like they got paid enough for these companies to come in and do what they're doing. That's a local thing, but you can understand that. The second one is that there is direct evidence that it causes very small earthquakes, and there is the thought that at some point it could cause a major one. Hasn't yet. No real indications that it's going to, but that's one of the issues that they have. And the one that's most important is that there are places where the water is higher, where the oil is higher in the ground than the water supply. So if they screw it up, it's entirely possible that the oil sinks down into the water supply and ruins the water supply for that area. That hasn't happened either, but you can understand maybe why people might be concerned about those things. By the way, folks, all this oil here isn't going to lower the price. Fracking is expensive. They need basically $80 a barrel to be profitable. So it's not going to lower the price, but it has been one of the biggest reasons why the U.S. has become mostly oil independent over the last 20 years. This area right here is a big reason for that. Now, give me 1 second. I got to take a... Not everything here is underground, folks. Obviously, there's stuff that's above ground. We talked about rugby. We talked about Minot. The only thing I can tell you about the little town of Stanley. Now, folks, I want you to look out the window and see what you're looking at here. And I want you to imagine that you live in this part of the country and you can invent the Olympic diving board. Yes, it was invented in Stanley.
Attention, ladies and gentlemen, coming in approximately 10 minutes. Spare next station stop of Williston, North Dakota. If Williston is your stop, now would be an excellent time to look around, start gathering up all those personal belongings and our luggage, head downstairs next to the train. Williston is another quick stop, so unless it is your stop, we please ask that you remain seated. Once again, Williston is not a service stop, so please remain seated to be able to do our work here. Here at Williston, car attendants will be making 2 stops. Could be working the Seattle section on the first stop. Once we're done with that, we'll pull the train up and work the 1415 and rear sleeper. Once again, 2 stops here in Williston. We're working the Seattle section on the first stop, and then the Portland section, 1415 and rear sleeper on the second stop. Williston, North Dakota, next stop.
That's right. So, again, imagine yourself, folks, that you live in this area and you are able to invent the Olympic diving board. I'm not sure how that happens, but it was invented in Stanley, North Dakota. Our next stop is going to be Williston, as he just mentioned. Williston is the smallest city in the country with an international airport. Yes, Williston, population 20,000, has an international airport. No, you cannot book a flight to London tomorrow. That is not going to happen. I believe the international terminal there is there primarily due to the oil and military business in this part of the country. But it is there, and they do have the record as the smallest city in the country with an international airport. Now, after we leave Williston, folks, about 20 minutes after we leave Williston, not long at all, you're going to start to see a series of rock formations appear on the right side of the, or north side of the train. Those rock formations were formed by the glaciers as they came through thousands of years ago, and they cut through the rocks, and you'll be able to see that. You'll see direct evidence of that because the water lines from the glaciers as they melted are still on those rocks. Easy to see, you can't miss them. This was once an inland ocean that was more than 1,000 feet deep. Okay, so you want to know why the ground is so fertile? That kind of helps explain that. Off to the left, you got to be looking at just the right moment. Roughly about 30 minutes after we leave Williston, we're going to pass Fort Union, which is a 19th century, a replica of a 19th century trading fort. Yes, it looks like a military fort. That's because they did very big business and they frequently needed help from the U.S. military. These were not states at that point, these were territories. Most of it was just the Pacific Northwest Territory or something like that, Louisiana Territory, etc. But if you do happen to see that fort, that was one of the busiest in the country at that time. We don't have exact numbers because a lot of the business they did then was bartering, in other words, trade one item for another. But the rough estimate was that at its peak, right around 1850, that they were doing about $400,000 to $500,000 a year in business. So you can understand why they might have needed protection from a whole bunch of different various groups of people that would have been out here at that time looking to maybe some profits that maybe didn't belong to them. So not hard to figure that out. After that, folks, we're going to go sailing through Montana for the rest of the day. I'm going to tell you just a little bit about those next few stops after that. The next stop after that will be Wolf Point. Wolf Point takes its name from a point in the Missouri River. Go back to the 1840s, before anybody even lived there. A group of hunters are out there one day and they shoot up a bunch of wolves and they dress the carcasses and so on, but overnight it freezes. And they leave hundreds of wolves' carcasses on a point in the Missouri River. The next day, a steamboat comes through, and yes, steamboats came all the way up here, and somebody on that steamboat pointed out all the wolves' carcasses on that point in the Missouri River. That became Wolf Point, and when the town was built there, they took that name. Can't make this stuff up. True story. The next two are even more bizarre than that. Malta and Glasgow. Okay? Both are railroad towns. They would not exist were it not for the railroad coming through there. So as the railroad officials are building their towns, they spun the globe, and stopped it with their finger, and they landed on Malta and Glasgow. Okay? That's how they named the town. Which brings to mind the question, if they had landed on Beijing and Tokyo, would we have Beijing, Montana? Maybe? I don't know. Possibly. And finally, folks, the last one I'm going to tell you about is Havre, Montana. Now, lots of people think that that was named after the little town of France, Le Havre. Nah, not quite that sophisticated. You've got to go back to the 1890s, folks. The town was just getting built. It didn't have a name yet. There was a guy and his wife that were riding in one day on horseback, and they weren't getting along. They were fighting. They were having a bad day. So they decided to stop at the local tavern and see if they could get a drink and try to resolve their differences. So they walked into the bar, and the bartender said something to the guy about his wife being good looking, and the guy said, "That's fine, I don't want her, you can have her." Have her Montana. Any questions, folks? All right. I hope you enjoyed it. Enjoy the ride, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Give me about 7 or 8 minutes here to get my voice back, and then I'll be open, folks. Okay? Enjoy the ride, folks.
Was that pretty acceptable? I mean, not like we were, but we were not knowing what we were saying.